She's in a staring contest with the ceiling again. Looks like the ceiling's winning.
I'm not in a staring contest with the ceiling, Buttercup. I'm just kind of...
Psst, check out my Patreon. Alright, so after the train wreck that was Derby Dollies, I sincerely hope that Bubbles the Blue isn't anywhere near as terrible with its story, characters, and execution. Oh man, I tell you, I've never come close to quitting a review more than that last one, but thankfully that's in the past now and we can just move forward from there. Bubbles the Blue, an episode named not after her corresponding color of the Powerpuff Girls trio, but because she's feeling pretty down. Yep, that's it. For the entire episode, Bubbles is sad and the other girls try to cheer her up. Needless to say, this is going to be a less complicated episode, similar to a slight hiccup.
And now back to Animal Globe. Ah, yes, the majestic dolphin is completely at home here in the tranquil sea.
Because this cartoon is physically incapable of coming up with original television programs, thus resulting in everything being a parody of something far more successful than this reboot will ever be, Blossom and Buttercup are watching dolphins on Animal Globe. You know, instead of Animal Planet, Animal Globe, haha. Unfortunately, when they arrive, they see their sister is under some distress as she wallows in her bed all by her lonesome. Unlike the typically joyful and spunky Bubbles that they know. Bubbles is sad, not for any particular reason, she's just sad, and yet her sisters can't seem to comprehend the fact that she's just a person with regular human emotions just like everyone else. Just because her name is Bubbles doesn't mean she has to be bubbly all the time. Wow, what a concept! Do you mean characters can feel more than one emotion?
You tired?
No.
You sick?
No.
You hungry?
Now, in what situation would blowtorching a chicken cheer Bubbles up? She's an animal lover, dipshit. She's not gonna react kindly to you killing a living creature. Yeah, somehow this just doesn't register with Blossom or Buttercup despite the fact that Bubbles has been sad plenty of other times in this show. But okay, they do try to justify this at least by saying that this time there isn't really a reason for Bubbles' lower mood. She just feels down spontaneously, which is fine because I'm sure we've all gone through that. It's just Buttercup and Blossom's constant prying that really makes this situation worse than it is. Blossom even does this existential bit where she talks about the harsh reality of life and the pressures one faces under the eyes of others, which is surprisingly not a reference to something. It's a perfectly harmless gag, really. And then the professor walks in.
Hey, girls.
Jeez! Professor, you scared us!
Oh, sorry, girls. At least we know the new soundless slippers I invented are working.
But of course, he was wearing his recently invented soundless slipper. A slipper so soundless, nobody can hear you sneaking up on them. Hence, the girls getting scared here. You know how nearly every episode has to have a recurring gag in this show? Well, take a wild guess what the running joke is in this week's episode. It does have some payoff later on at least, but that's all I've got. It's the same trick we've seen dozens of times before.
Sneak past the cops! Sneak up on ninjas! Boom! Hey, did you hear that?
What? Exactly. Soundless slippers.
You know the fact that the slipper speaks there contradicts the very meaning of the word soundless? Just because you whisper doesn't mean you're silent. And so the girls get called in by the mayor to go stop an angry armadillo from rampaging around town. Or, as Blossom calls it, harm-adillo. And the two proceed to beat up on him something fierce while Bubbles just kind of floats there from the sidelines, still feeling down in the dumps despite having the opportunity to beat up a bad guy. In order to defeat this monster, Buttercup transforms into a baseball bat and Blossom, a pillow. Well, that's kinda lame all things considered, and I don't really see how a pillow matches Blossom's usual array of office supplies, but I guess they aren't allowed to show something too vigorous considering this is an animal we're talking about here. Not sure. Either way, the girls drop what they're doing halfway through and proceed to think of another way to cheer Bubbles up. A song.
Here are a few of your favorite things. We got Octi, some crowns, and a butterfly.
An 8-course meal with pastrami on
We
rye!
got tea party, a fuzzy cat.
A big bowl of lint from the laundromat!
Yeah, so next we get a montage where the girls try to improve her mood with a bunch of things that she likes. Although it doesn't really work because Buttercup just names a bunch of random shit and then the professor sneaks up on the girls again. At the very least, I think this use of stock images here isn't as obnoxious as it usually is because they're only used for Buttercup's items and used in a way that they contrast all of the things that Blossom tries to suggest. It feels more purposeful than usual, although I still would have preferred their absence entirely. Going back to the professor, he can clearly see that Bubbles is feeling blue today and that her sisters can't comprehend that, with Blossom questioning the semantics of her name and Buttercup threatening to make her cheer up if she can't do it herself. Clearly, both of these methods are not the way to handle this situation. I think, all in all, the premise so far makes a ton of sense. I mean, considering that Blossom and Buttercup have never really encountered this situation before, they wouldn't really know how to handle it. Also, considering the fact that they're like 6 years old, they wouldn't really be able to comprehend the seriousness of the depression that Bubbles is facing the way the more experienced and mentally developed professor would. And yes, if you haven't figured it out already, Bubbles is experiencing depression, not sadness. There is a pretty big difference, and quite frankly, this episode does a decently good job of portraying the behaviors that someone with depression could replicate. I'll save my overall thoughts for the end, but so far this is turning out to be pretty well done. The mayor calls again, so Blossom and Buttercup head back out to face Armadillo a second time while Bubbles sits quietly in her room. During this fight, Blossom concludes that she must have done something wrong, while Buttercup concludes that someone else did something wrong to her, so they proceed to bail on Armadillo once again and go handle the situation their way.
I'm a primate, baby, hanging with my squad, strutting down the street with my rockin' bod, shaking my hips like boom, 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 that's right.
So, with that out of the way, as you can see, Buttercup decides it's Mojo's fault and proceeds to interrogate him, even though he had nothing to do with how Bubbles is feeling. More on this in a minute. Meanwhile, Blossom is back at home, begging Bubbles for forgiveness and showering her in thank you cards despite the fact that Bubbles continues to assure her that she isn't the reason she's feeling sad.
I'm sorry I remade the bed after you made it yesterday and every other day.
I also find it kind of interesting how this episode handles Blossom and Buttercup's attempts to cure Bubbles of her problem and how they resort to bargaining and anger respectively in order to fix everything. I totally get that they hate to see their sister like this, and you can tell that their hearts are in the right place, but they're going about it all wrong. Speaking of, Buttercup decides to bust in with a happy ray and blast Bubbles with a face full of joy. But that isn't the solution to the problem either. Blossom begins yelling, Buttercup begins yelling, Bubbles tries to calm them down, and pretty soon it just becomes one giant shout fest as everybody talks over each other.
Girls!
No! No more!
Oh, my slippers.
Like I said, there's a payoff, something you rarely ever see with these running gags. Anyways, the professor defends Bubbles from the scorn of her sisters, who have to go deal with that armadillo for a third time, and right before they're about to finish it off by stabbing through its hard shell and killing it, Bubbles swoops in and realizes that the armadillo is sad too. So she basically spews out the lesson of the episode, and that's that regardless of the reason, or even if there's no reason at all, it's important to be there for somebody when they're feeling down, which Buttercup and Blossom clearly were not doing this entire time.
We didn't need to fix Bubbles. We just needed to be there for her.
I don't get it.
Let's just sit with her.
I'm bored. What are we looking at?
And once again, we can't just end the episode on a somber note. We have to shove in a joke at the last second to completely ruin the mood instead of wrapping up the story comfortably. I hate that this show does this so frequently. Not that it can't do it at all. There's plenty of times where a joke is made within the last 5 seconds of an episode, and that's perfectly fine. But when you have an episode like this, especially considering the subject matter and the way the characters come to the conclusion at the end, it just undercuts everything it's going for. Buttercup, let's go comfort our sister. Okay, Blossom. Wow, this is really boring. Just tells me that Buttercup doesn't actually care about the situation and is still being selfish. Sure, Blossom means what she said in wanting to be there for her sister, and she clearly proves that when she pushes Buttercup off the pier, but Buttercup couldn't care less about Bubbles' feelings. That's what this ending gag leads me to infer. hence why it should have been omitted. If it just would have ended with the three of them together with the armadillo on the pier, it would have been a tight-knit, satisfying resolution. Instead, there's clearly still conflict between two of the sisters here, and that's not really a good way to end the episode. But regardless, that's Bubbles the Blue. It's pretty straightforward with minimal layers of depth, but hey, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If anything, the simpler episodes also tend to be a lot safer compared to the excessive, wannabe radical but truthfully awkward counterparts. The focus here tends to be more centered on Blossom and Buttercup trying to come to terms with their sister's feelings, seeing as they are the ones who are having difficulty accepting it. Likely because they do not wish to confirm the reality of a situation that they do not want to face. They have this utopian visualization of how Bubbles is supposed to be the joy of their lives, the super bouncy and happy member of the team that can always balance out their more negative or realistic views on the world. It's as if the loss of this peace, this third, this joy, suddenly cripples their own ability to function. Just like with any member of the group, without Bubbles, the team falls apart, and Buttercup and Blossom clearly do not want this to happen. Just like the cogs of a machine, every part needs to perform its function in order to operate properly. But once one of these cogs gets broken or misplaced, the entire system could fail to perform its duty efficiently. If anything, despite the title card color implying that this is about Bubbles, this is a Blossom and Buttercup episode. They are the characters that cannot come to terms with the sadness Bubbles feels. They are the characters that have the spotlight throughout the duration of this 11 minutes, and they are the characters that learn the lesson in the end. Well, one of them at least. It's like they do not want to accept a weakness. They believe that Bubbles should be happy all the time because that is the status quo. And once a threat becomes prevalent enough to break said status quo, they feel exposed. They do not want to accept this change due to their fear of what it may lead to. What if Bubbles never fights again? What if she never returns to normal? These are thoughts that someone experiencing depression or witnessing somebody else experiencing depression may encounter at some point. What if things are never the same again? That's something that a lot of people are afraid of. Change. I find the fact that this episode does not provide a defined reason for why Bubbles is feeling this way to be a smart move. As with many others who've experienced these gray, demoralizing feelings, sometimes there just isn't a reason for why it happens. Depression can just spontaneously occur with no real cause. I mean, sure, there are plenty of cases where there is a well-defined cause, but sometimes it just happens for inexplicably no reason, and I find that to be a strong aspect of the episode's story. Leaving it up to viewer interpretation, allowing the audience to infer and apply their own ideas onto the character gives the episode more flexibility in its watch value. Experiencing depression is a semi-universal situation that, while maybe not everyone has had to undergo at the same level, a grand percentage of people have gone through. For that reason, despite the needless gags and jokes that just don't work, I'm able to overlook those flaws and deem this one of the best episodes of Season 2. That was probably a more sophisticated conclusion I drew than what the show probably intended, but hey, a lot of analyzing film and animation comes down to viewer interpretation of the material presented by the creator. So yeah, that's my ramble on Bubbles the Blue. It's really good, especially compared to Derby Dollies, which was the polar opposite in about every single way. That's all for this review though. See you in the next one.